Welcome to Flutespace, a platform created to share interesting stories related to life as a flutist and discovering inspiring content in form of a podcast. You can catch up with us on our Instagram at theflutespace, and you can listen to our episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and YouTube. All these links can be found in our link tree in the description. If you want to support us, you can buy us a coffee on buymeacoffee.com/theflutespace. Last week we had an amazing experience in Ghent. We went to a festival.
We went to a Baroque festival called Cydonia Barocca, and for 3 days we listened to amazing flutists playing chamber music and also other things. And we listened to Alexis Kossenko presenting his flute collection, and we also had a talk with him.
This was really interesting. I mean, he showed us flutes from Renaissance, I believe.
I think it started in Renaissance period, and then we went chronologically
to the modern flute.
Exactly, and everything that was in between, like simple system flutes and how the Böhm system developed. And I think
how there was even a flute which had a C sharp trill or C sharp trill, where your left pinky is trilling. So amazing. It makes actually sense what Mahler wrote sometimes. Yeah. And he also played on those flutes actual pieces from that time written for those flutes. And it was incredible to hear, Schubert's variations on an actual flute from that time.
Yes, or for example, the Vienne concerto on a traverso, on a one-keyed flute, and it sounded just amazing.
Yeah. Also the Beethoven for symphony excerpt, that was also pretty cool.
So we were very impressed to listen to him, and also it was just very eye-opening to talk to him and to listen to what he was telling us in the conversation we had. So
because he is a modern flutist with a really big interest and curiosity for Baroque and early music.
Not just Baroque, but also like historically informed practice and like historically authentic sounds.
Yeah.
So he's always choosing the flute of the exact period of time of the composition to make it sound as authentic as it can be.
And he goes really into research of who was the flute builder of the time, what were the differences. So
also geographically.
Yeah. And so in this episode, he will share more about that, and we will talk about other things as well. So we really hope you enjoy.
We're here today with Alexis Kossenko. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for taking time. And we just listened to a concert of you playing, where you played also the flauto d'amore. And we watched, of course, a lot of videos where you play a lot of different instruments, and we wanted to ask, where do you get them all from? Are they all yours, or do you borrow them? How do you find them?
Well, I do have many instruments because I am basically at the meeting point or mixture of performer and collector. Sometimes some collectors are not professional performers. Sometimes performers don't have such a big amount of flutes. But many are mine, indeed, which I bought when it's about original, especially from 19th century instruments. I can buy them in auctions, or there are different ways, or antiquariats. And of course, there's a great deal of restoration often, and it might be, a risk that you take when you buy an old instrument which is not in perfect condition, and you take a risk. You don't know if after restoration it will be really fantastic or sometimes disappointing. But anyway, I started buying some flutes with almost my pocket money when I was quite young, and the first gigs that I had, I started to buy some old flutes because I was interested, and then you get this taste, and each of them is really different character, and then it gets a little bit of an addiction, I'm afraid. But my interest was that as a performer, I do not want to neglect any part of the repertoire. I was trained as a modern flutist. From a very early age, when I was a teenager, I started recorder and then traverso when I was 14. So,
did you in school or on your own?
No. Just first on my own because I had a big appetite for early music. But I never wanted to stop modern flute. Also because I wanted to play all the repertoire. I do love 20th century music and 19th century music. And my aim became quite clear. I wanted to be able to play all those pieces, but give to each of them as much personality and individual taste by picking up the right instrument. So that became a little bit of a professional project.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and also we can hear that. I mean, you have a very particular sound on every flute, and you bring out such nice colors. And we're wondering, how do you approach the sound and the colors for each flute?
Well, you have first to let the instrument guide you, not try to project what you believe to be the sound, but explore what the instrument requires. If I take an example, let's pick up the middle of the 19th century or the 1830s, 1840s. In this time, flutes have very different character according to what nationality they have. French flutes, Viennese flutes, German flutes, English flutes have all a very different character. And first of all, you can see in the bore, you can see in how thick the wood can be, the weight of the instrument, of course, the number of keys, but that's almost secondary, and the mouth, the embouchure. And when you see how small and oval the embouchure hole can be on a French flute, how big and square or rectangle on a Viennese flute, you immediately understand the sound is not going to be the same. And you can explore and see what the flute wants you to do. It's a bit empiric. It's like going to a country, learning the language and seeing also how people talk, how people live, and to get a culture out of all this. And then it's not only learning the language in books or at school, but it's also getting filled and fed with all the aspects around it. And of course, the relationship there is between the repertoire and the flute that this repertoire was written for. An English flute, for example, that's very interesting. I did not have real English flutes until recently, because I always disliked these instruments. They have a very high pitch, which is sometimes 450 hertz, which is at first sight very unpleasant, because we all prefer lower flutes. Yes. Because the lower, the richer, the more
warmer.
Exactly. And when you take a flute with such high pitch, it's harsh, it's shrill, and but this is what I like. So I try to understand also the aesthetic. You read books, you read treatises. For example, Nicholson and his ideal of sound, which was to have in the low register as reedy a sound as possible. The ideal is to imitate the oboe, which was very far from that in French school. And you can also observe that on English flutes, the bottom notes are extremely low. The low D is like really so flat that the only way to bring it up to the level is to play with a really intense timbre.
It's like a very nasal sound.
Exactly. And then you can make link in your imagination and then think how Irish flute players play. And of course it comes directly from that, because basically the Irish flute is the direct heir of the romantic flute of that time, and the flute is virtually the same actually. So things like that. And you put all together. You take it from the instrument, you take it from reading the treatises and the different books that discuss that in the time, the repertoire, and this is a kind of alchemy which gives you kind of direction how to play that instrument. I might be wrong, but the more evidences show the same direction, the more I think maybe I'm on the right path.
But this is so interesting, no? That like the way how the flute is built shows you how they were playing probably at that time, or what the ideal sound was.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
And well, sure, there are of course different flutes in different countries and everything, but currently, do you have a favorite flute builder?
It's difficult to say that I have a favorite flute builder, because I like many of them, often for different reasons, or it can also depend of their models. For example, I would say I have many flutes made by Martin Venner.
Mm-hmm.
They are extremely reliable instrument. He's an excellent maker. Some people might think or say that they lack a proper character, but they're too easy to play or too open. But I think that they can be flattering at first sight, but you can also do a lot with them. And I think this is also important. You can, I like the instruments by Giovanni Tardino. I think Jan de Veen is a very good maker. I think that Jean-Jacques Melzer in Paris is also very good. And I certainly for Wimals, and I forget all the makers that I should mention. And my idea is not to flatter everyone, but I like different models of different makers, and I like to work with them all. Also, I mean, those that I had the privilege to meet. But there is also one very important thing. It's to get the opportunity to play on original flutes. Either you have the great luck to, or if you're rich, it's always a matter of money. Huh? It's not only luck, but I'm not. But I invested everything that I earned in my instrument. So maybe you can cut that. Huh?
We can cut a lot of things.
But for example, to visit collectors, when maybe sometimes in museums, there are still a few museums where it's possible to get to touch the instrument.
Yeah, really, they let you try.
Not many, but for example, in the museum in Paris, I think now it's almost impossible. But in the past, I had the possibility to try different flutes, and they asked me to make a recording on the haute-terre flute, which is actually the only known haute-terre le romain flute. So, Unfortunately, I did it when I was too young, and now I wish that I would do it again with the experience that I have.
Yeah.
Because I was, of course, very impressed, very happy, but I didn't have enough experience to really taste what I was doing and to really understand the instrument. For example, somebody like Peter Spohr in Frankfurt has an amazing collection, and then you can try some of the originals of many models that are copied by many makers, like the original Palanca, Stainsby, or Nost. Then you get to know really what's the value and what are the qualities of these instruments, which are sometimes not approached.
And what is the difference between, for example, an original Palanca and the rebuild?
It can depend on many factors, but sometimes the makers nowadays will adapt the model to their own ideal of what the flute should be. Some of them tried, manipulated the original. Some other makers did not. Sometimes they make a reproduction just based on plans, which were made by somebody else. Sometimes they copy copies. I think it's very important to be as much in touch with the original as possible. There's something which it's hard to reproduce nowadays. Makers nowadays have to relearn to make flutes. And the Baroque flute making is almost a niche. It's a small market, but it's growing, of course. But imagine in a time when such makers, such as Nost, Otteter, Oberlander, or Denner, were heritating the craftsmanship from their fathers, who heritated from their fathers. There were many generations, and that was the top of instrument building of the time. So that is something which is hard to reproduce when this heritage or this tradition was completely lost, and some people had to relearn that. This is extraordinary what they did, really extraordinary. But you can see also how instruments were made, maybe less regular than they are now, but there is often something in the sound. When I tried the Nost from the Peter Sport collection, I was amazed with the response that this instrument had. I don't know, it's hard to compare. It's just a great respect for the ancient builders, really, an immense respect.
Yeah, especially this heritage. I mean, it's not just instrument building, it's for a lot of these traditions that we had, that we lost this kind of heritage. I mean, like bakers and things like that. But you mentioned before that sometimes you get instruments from auctions. How do you find out about auctions? Where do you find them about them?
Well, when you're used to watch, you know where to find. You can be addicted and make a research every day or every week, and you know what are the regular auctions. Like in France, there is an important auction twice a year in Vichy. Everybody knows about it, and this is where at least instruments sold in France, that most of them end up there. So you can find, it depends in which moment, but you can have sometimes really interesting instruments. And it's a bit of a bargain, because sometimes if there are many interesting instruments, the attention of the buyers will be focused on some really precious ones, and sometimes in between another instrument also very interesting, will get less attention than if it was shining among really crap things. That instrument would get a much higher price.
Right.
Sometimes you can be lucky. I just bought a late 18th century French flute in very good condition for like less expensive than a copy. And it works better, so I'm quite happy.
Yeah.
But it is fragile, that we must know.
Yeah, it's incredible because string players, they often they play on very, very old instruments, and
But there is a major difference with string players. Is that first of all, the instruments never stopped to be played, because even if they were sometimes radically changed, the same instrument was considered valuable enough to be modified, to retain the main qualities. Even when Stradivarius was modernized, it's horrible what was done to the instrument. But they still consider that the main properties of the instruments remain. And these instruments, the fact that they were played keep them strong somehow. And wind instruments, because they were cheaper, because they couldn't be modified enough to adapt to a change of pitch, a change of sound aesthetic, a need for many more keys or a completely different bore, people just forgot them in a corner and bought a new one. Therefore, these instruments stopped being played. And on top of that, we expose to a much greater danger wind instruments than string instruments, because we will put inside warmth and humidity.
Yes.
And of course, the wood is very sensitive to that. So if you play a very old instrument that got dry during 2 centuries, and suddenly you bring warmth and humidity into a very dry wood, it will literally crack or explode. So that's a risk. For this, we need to prepare it, to oil it, to play a little bit regularly,
and
a
every
bit
day
more.
And
I think the instrument, I believe, of course, this is a big subject among in the museum, the conservateur, to let the instruments be played or not. And in Utrecht, in the last festival, there were conferences about that. And I remember the conservator of the Rijksmuseum, the instrument department, made a conference to explain why the instruments should be preserved, not to have any risk so they're not played, but some facsimile are made, so for people. And then my ex-teacher, Martin Holt, made another short conference to give the opposite opinion in front of the other guy. That was very interesting. He said, I completely disagree with you, and this is why. Because playing facsimile is actually very different from the original instrument. Even if you measure and everything is the same, the life of the instrument is not the same. And this we cannot replace how an instrument got older and how being played gave it some other properties. And of course it's a risk, but this risk can be limited by proper care. And I do believe, and some people agree with me, that an instrument if the instrument is not too fragile, is not already cracked, and ivory instruments are very endangered for this reason. If the instrument gets used to be played regularly, little after little again, and under a very strict control, of course, then maybe it's possible. At least maybe not to be taken for concert, but at least to be tried for some minutes. Then this is the ideal of sound of this period in this time.
That's amazing. Actually, so you play a lot of different flutes from different periods of time. How do you handle the change between them? Because the fingerings are very different. Also, as you mentioned, the embouchure hole can be small or large. How do you do it? And does it happen that sometimes you mix up fingerings?
To this question, I will answer no. Or almost never. Sometimes I can be a little bit afraid in a concert if I'm a bit nervous, and I can be afraid. I can have a doubt during a second. There is something you did not mention. It's because the embouchure hole and the sound is one thing. The fingerings is another thing, but also the intonation. And this is actually even more crucial, because two instruments made in the same period can have a completely different type of intonation. This note which is too high on that, with this finger on that one, will be too low on the other one. So there is something a little bit mysterious, which is that often, with experience now, when I try an instrument, even for the first time, I can within some minutes play it naturally with correcting the intonation as it should be. Your ear will anticipate and you will put you in the right place. Now,
so you have the motorics of the fingers basically kind of for each flute, but if you have a new flute, then you hear the differences, so you adapt very fast.
So you have to understand kind of
the different big fingering systems. There is a one-key flute, and then the flute with many keys, which basically, if it's 4 or 6 or 8, will be based on the same system. And a flute with 16 keys, an all system flute, ordinary, even if it has 16 keys, it's like if it has 8 plus some extra. The fingerings remain the same for the basics of the philosophy of the instrument, but this fingering will be high on that flute, and that one will be low, and on the other flute is just opposite. Or sometimes it's the same fingering, but the keys being positioned a little bit lower, or not exactly in the same place, then, But what I want to talk about, and sorry for this long introduction, but
it's very interesting, no worries.
I became completely convinced that a changing flute is a little bit like changing language, and probably changing instruments. By the way, we have a few performers, a few artists here, among my colleagues, who play flute and another instrument, or harpsichord, for example. I play different types of flutes, but I don't play another instrument. I learned different types of flutes from a quite early age. Modern flute was my first instrument. Then 8 years later, when I was 13, I started to play the recorder, which was kind of first step into the direction of early music. When I was 14, I started the traverso. So that's already 3 different fingering systems. Later, first key flutes, then Renaissance flute as another different key system. I trained very early to practice them intensively, but change also very often to become very flexible. And now I became completely convinced that it is a little bit like the people who are bilingual or trilingual or real polyglots. It happens that I have a daughter who is if not trilingual, because she's half Bulgarian and half French. She lives in Bulgaria, she was born in France, and she speaks both languages, and she's a true bilingual. By this I mean that there's no language dominating the other. Yeah. She can dream in both languages when she speaks in her sleep. She counts in whatever language. She thinks in each language depending of what country or what surrounding it is. And I even suspect sometimes that she doesn't have exactly the same personality in each language, because each language reflects a different social and cultural background. I would love to be in touch with a neurologist to check if a changing instrument activates the same zones of the brain
than changing the language.
Yeah, because, sorry to interrupt you again, but yeah, I think we are both bilingual
also.
And I think we everyone who is bilingual experiences this
natural change of system. You're not translating anymore, and probably the same for the flute.
And then there's sometimes a sort of dissociation from another language, or something comes way more automatically, but there's no priority in both languages. But so then, actually considering playing flutes, then
it's the idea I have, is my hypothesis. I'm not entirely sure, but I feel it works like that. Yeah. And when I change instrument, of course it depends how well I know the instrument. And some flutes that I've played more than others, I find tomorrow, if you come to the conference, it might be interesting, because I will play a little bit of most of the flutes. I brought 40. And of course I have no time to warm up with every flute. So you will quickly see on which flute I'm immediately convincing, and on which flute takes a bit more. I might pick up the wrong key because I did not have the necessary 5 minutes, or the intonation would be so-so. But yeah, that's an interesting thing. And basically, I don't think you need to be specially gifted to play well 2 or 3 or 4 different types of flutes. It's probably more of mental projection, to know what you want, to know what you know, how curious, and how you can feed yourself with different cultural backgrounds.
That you find your own curiosity within each.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that what I learn most from is to play a lot of music and the musical surrounding. You learn a style not by reading in treatises how you should play that music, also from this, but that's a small amount of it, but mostly by playing a lot of music of that time.
And playing in different formations and groups, how do you, because if you're playing with authentic instruments, how do you blend with the other instruments, with strings, or do you oboes, or with the others? How do you, because also the intonation is a thing that you need to be careful about. How do you blend?
My recipe for blending, I don't have any. It's just it's experience. But it also has to do with what you want to obtain. If you don't obtain it, maybe that you don't really know what you want to, or And of course, it's also a matter of experience, I believe. Some instruments blend better than others, and sometimes some instruments of a certain type will blend very well with other instruments of the same time, of the same style. For example, it was amazing to notice in orchestra projects that when the oboe player had, even if I was playing a copy, German flute from 1840, for example. For instance, I was playing a Liebe. He happened to have an original oboe that was made in Dresden in the 1840s. Well, I think it's not only in my imagination that it immediately worked very well. If we play German music, but the oboe player, just to mention the oboe player, but of course it's very crucial blending or difficult blending of the orchestra, flute and oboe. If the oboe player has a French instrument of the end of 19th century and I have a German instrument, it's not so easy to blend. If I take a French flute, it blends. If he takes a German oboe from the same time, it blends. Because those instruments were made in a certain time with a similar aesthetic. I did a quite interesting experimentation I recorded 4 CDs box dedicated to the music of Eugène Valquirs, French composer of the Romantic era. Most of the music he wrote is for the early system. But at the end of his life, his last pieces were already probably written, well, I'm sure about it, with the Böhm system in mind. Although him, as a flute player, probably learned a bit, but he was not anymore in activity as a player. But he was composing for his colleagues, and many of them had started to play on the Böhm system. So you see the change of aesthetic and technical demand in his writing and his compositions. For one piece, we decided to do a special experiment. It's a trio for 3 flutes, and because it was written in a time where probably some flute players were starting to play the Böhm flute, and some others were still playing with their old system, with the ordinary flute, I decided to mix them. First flute, I was playing a conical wooden Böhm system with rings by Godefroy. Second flute was played by a very early silver Louis Lot, one of the earliest. And third flute was a Toulouse, 8 keys. So 3 different flutes. 2 conical, 1 cylindrical, 1 of metal, 2 with Böhm system. It's very hard to hear the difference between the 3 sounds, believe it or not.
But just because it was around the same time, but the flutes were different.
The flutes were very different, but they were made in the same time, and therefore, despite all these technical differences, the ideal of the sound of the flute in this time was a certain thing and was not so diverse.
That's very interesting. Do you actually have a favorite period of time for music to play? Or, I mean, you were mentioning that you like all of them and that's why you want to make everything sound great.
It's very hard for me to choose a repertoire, but how frustrating. My favorite period of history of music is around Monteverdi, and maybe Monteverdi himself. And that's basically the period of music that I play least, because as a flute player, I can consider the Renaissance flute or the recorder, but I know that this instrument was only a side instrument for players of the cornet or and therefore there's not much repertoire to play unless you transcribe and you play all the flying repertoire on the recorder. But it's a little bit of cheating historically. I know I do it sometimes for my own pleasure, but therefore my answer is that it's exactly the repertoire that I can't play that I like most. But maybe, may I mention Mendelssohn?
Yes, of course. I mean, Mendelssohn is great. A great choice. So, and before you were also talking about your education, and we wanted to ask if you had to pick the 3 most influential or inspiring mentors during your education, whom would you choose?
Well, without hesitation, Anna Marion, who played a very important role in my life because, I met him when I was 12. I entered his class in the conservatory when I was 14, in the Conservatoire de Paris. I think he had a great influence on me he was also somebody I really loved deeply, because I was by far the youngest in the class, and I was far from my home, and he was a little bit like a grandfather for me. I mean, I did not see him often, just for the class, but I felt this responsibility and this, the care he had about me, and also the respect he had for me, because he's somebody who respected very much my musical personality, and who did not try to make me become a clone of himself. But I think that he's opening his instinctive way of playing. I'm somebody who can be very analytic and very instinctive at the same time. I try always to have the two things to approach of music to meet and to agree. And his sense of colors probably influenced me very much. When I was his student, I was not conscious about all this. After he died, some years later, when I listened to him again, suddenly I discovered how he was playing. And so but I was never conscious that he was so amazing, and so full of colors, and not the kind of standardized modern sound as we consider it sometimes today. So that's somebody who influenced me. I worked with Martin Roth as well, and he's somebody who certainly influenced me, because there are many things that I like very much in his musical and flute approach, and he was very open-minded. And in fact, the people who are most open-minded, most respectful to my personality are the people I myself respect and who influenced me a lot, because I didn't feel that I had to fight. I felt respected, and I felt free to pick up and to listen and to take the.
That's so important, to have these kind of mentors, that they give you space but also guidance to grow just personally. That's, you were very lucky.
Well, this was a really nice conversation, and you will have to go to the concert very soon. But before that, we have 5 questions for you.
So you have to answer them very fast.
3 questions. Very short. Yeah. Okay. What kind of dance from the Baroque period is your favorite?
Pasakai.
Okay. And what is your least favorite tonality on traverso, and why?
E flat minor, because there is a Kernberger sonata which I still want to play one day in concert.
That sounds impossible to play.
Yes, but I'm somebody who is very têtu.
Stubborn.
Yes, exactly. So I really want to do it, and I will do it, but it takes time.
If someone can play it, then for sure it will be you.
You're too kind, I'm not sure. I'm not the only one.
If you had to choose a soundtrack for your life, what would it be?
A soundtrack? Can it be just a piece of music?
It can be whatever.
L'Enfant des Sortilèges by Ravel.
Okay.
Without hesitation.
Okay.
We say it differently. We say we call the piece that you take on the desert island.
Yes. So it will be Ravel.
Amazing.
Thank you so much for talking to us. It was very interesting.
It was a big pleasure.